what can I say? I should say, wow. To be introduced by host Bredekamp in such effusive terms is not only very thrilling, but it makes one nervous. But nevertheless, it's my great honor to be here this evening, and knowing that I'm among friends, so what I'm going to say this evening will be words to friends. But before I do that, I wish I had the right to respond in German to Dr. Bredekamp for his very generous introduction. But this introduction, which sort of takes the trajectory of my intellectual biography and my life, weaving them together, for me is very important because Haus, Kulturen, Welt has also been important in that trajectory. This is the 15th year that I've come to lecture in this house. And it's, again, very, very important to acknowledge that this lecture is under the auspices of the Mosse-Lecture. And there is another return, which is this linkage, this anniversary with Humboldt University, where I delivered a lecture that Dr. Bredekamp mentioned. So I thank Humboldt University enormously. And I want to thank Dr. Klaus Scherper for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a great honor. But before I go to my talk, I would like to use the opportunity to thank Ben Shearer and Catherine Klingon from Haus, Kulturen, Welt for hosting this lecture here. And on behalf of my colleague, Tarek Abu El Fatou, who so generously invited me to curate meeting point, I would like to begin this lecture by saluting him, because without him, this lecture would not have been possible. So thank you, Tarek. Yeah. My lecture, Civitas, Citizenship, Civility, Art, and the Civic Imagination, was born from the contact that I established with Tarek and meeting points. So many things have conspired to make the project of meeting points and our meeting here today historically important, not least of which are two anniversaries with which I will begin. The first one comes exactly in 2 days. You may then be aware that this coming Saturday, January 14th, marks a particularly portentous day, and for many people across the world, it also represents an inspiring anniversary, which is the collapse of the regime of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia. The forced abdication of power by Ben Ali in what has been termed the Jasmine Revolution began the process of an unprecedented massive civic power across North Africa and the Middle East that became the catalyst for the still unfolding Arab Spring. So far, these dramatic assertions of the principle of collective civic rights by the long repressed citizens in the various countries of the region have swept 4 long-serving authoritarian regimes and dictatorships, namely Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen, from power, with another Syria tottering on the edge of collapse. The collapse of these regimes has not only impacted the rethinking of the political structures of governance in the region and the importance of the consent of the governed. Their geopolitical appeal have touched even civic movements in the West, not least of which is the phenomenon of the Occupy Wall Street protests. But the phone of Bella Ali and his flight into exile to Saudi Arabia also illuminates one of those historical moments, like the assassination of JFK or the fall of the Berlin Wall, when people remember exactly where they were or what they were doing when such events happened. Last year, January 14, was perhaps such a moment for me. I was in Athens, Greece, after a long day of meeting at the offices of the Onassis Foundation, where Meeting Point 6 will travel to after Berlin, when the news of Ben Ali's flight from Tunisia filled the screen and the airwaves. I was to experience one of those moments of historical awareness as I stood petrified, like a stone statue in front of the television set in one of those standard Starwood hotels, watching the unfolding drama on the streets of Tunisian cities. I stood there frozen, partly out of astonishment and partly in awe of the surging energy and the indescribable fervor of Tunisians celebrating their liberation from the iron fist of the Ben Ali regime in less than a month of courageous, nonviolent revolt. Moments of such recall, such as the one in Athens a year ago, represent more than mnemonic acts of remembering. Instead, they carry a powerful principle, the sense of a historical awareness that delineates how the human condition is replete with and tied to temporal events, some indelibly paradigmatic and others much more ordinary. For millions of people in North Africa and the Middle East, and also for many here this evening, the Arab Spring and the regime changes that have followed in its wake is one of those indelible moments of historical awareness. First, with the realization that their mortal opponents, namely unaccountable brutal regimes, are indeed mortal and can be resisted. And second, that absolute power is ultimately accountable to the forces of a superior moral force, namely the rights of citizens to define their destiny. But the second anniversary I want to underline is far more important, and it occurred last week on January 4. It marked the first anniversary of the death of Mohamed Bouazizi in a hospital room in Sidi Bouzid, a small Tunisian town in one of the country's economically depressed areas. Mohamed Bouazizi was an unknown 26-year-old street food vendor who on December 17, 2010, set himself on fire in a desperate refutal of the Tunisian state's attempt to reduce his existence to the absolute state of bare life. Until his self-immolation in December 2010, his protest against the harassment of the provincial authorities intent on depriving him of the right to make a living with his meager wares of fruit and vegetables, Bouazizi would have died with little or no media fanfare. He would have simply disappeared, his tragic end unremarked upon, remaining unknown to the rest of the world as barely a humdrum statistic, were it not for the second conflagration his self-sacrifice ignited, which is the moral outrage of his fellow Tunisians whose own protests in support of him came to embody not only the singularity of Bouazizi's act and courage, but the expiation of the pent-up despair that had reduced the populace into accomplices in their own brutal incarceration. While my talk this evening is much more foregrounded in the conceptual project of Meeting Point 6 and its title, Locus Agonistes, Practices and Logics of the Civic, it nevertheless owes something to the unsettled state of global affairs in which the Arab Spring currently percolates. When I accepted the proposal to work on this project, I was initially interested in the way in which critical formats of contemporary art and certain forms of curatorial practice were deviating from conventional models of activism, and were instead tending towards a more nuanced approach that in its strategies and conceptual projections were based on the idea of the civic. Here it is necessary to underscore the extent to which what I am describing anticipated the kind of changes occurring today in North Africa and the Middle East. In fact, the region is not only the setting of locus agonistis, it was inspired by it. After a series of research trips that commenced in Lebanon, Tunisia, then went to Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Morocco between late 2009 and autumn of 2010, what was evident to me was a critical tendency towards civic-inspired projects, such as the development of new small-scale institutional spaces, the proliferation of artistic, cultural, and curatorial workshops, the rise of pedagogical models in cultural practice. It was also clear to me that these models of civic practices, based on the expansion of what I call the civic imagination, held the greatest appeal in those parts of the world that could be described as societies in transition. Such societies in the past could have been described with the reductive term third world, but the shift from a purely activist and political art-oriented model of artistic practice to a more civic-based conception of social and cultural practice, in my view, aligned both the artists, producers, and institutions in which they work in a civil society-based network model. Here we can adopt a general definition of civil society as the arena outside of the family, the state, and the market where people associate to advance common interests. Within such a model, it was not just enough to direct critiques towards official circuits of power, but more importantly, it was necessary to create civic spaces in which the articulation of the complex relationships between diverse members of the community, regardless of their class, gender, ethnicity, religion, and so on, can participate in debates. Civicness as such is based precisely on more discursive and dialogical models of exchange than on purely modes of contestation. Though there sure are such contestatory models, nevertheless, the types that interest us here are based more on those that produce the highest possibility for enlarging the scope of art and culture within civil society. If we take several examples of institutions and other activities in the region, let me use something like Ashkal Al-Wan in Beirut, or perhaps decolonizing architecture in Bezahut in Palestine, and perhaps the Arab Image Foundation, also based in Beirut. We can begin to see how these critical civic structures are being constructed around the region. The work of these small-scale organizations and the links they provide to discursive networks in and beyond the region, for me, represent a vital commitment towards the idea of the civic imagination. In the present deep winter of discontent, the potentiousness and the stark realities of the Arab Spring offer a grim yet inspiring backdrop to explore the role of art and culture in the production of the forms of civitas, which we can call collectivity, citizenship, belonging, and civility based on modes of exchange. But I am specifically interested in the ways in which the emergence of what I have been calling civic imagination in the practice of art and production of culture may be reformulating the classic models of activist practices that conceive of the public sphere as the active ground of contestation, and also proposing a shifting away from the enlightened liberal stance of engagement to the complex formats of production that disclose and articulate the construction of civic spaces, civil society, and civic practices as fundamental platforms where members of societies in transition build and share awareness of both their historicity and their contemporaneity. I am especially interested in how the practices and logics of the civic imagination can direct the reshaping of political and cultural life in those places where history is still in the process, those places where history is still in the making, that privilege the construction of civic spaces where disparate and sometimes opposing and contending political, economic, social, and cultural positions meet to strengthen the bonds of civitas and community. We have already underscored that civil society refers to the arena of uncoerced collective action around shared interests, purposes, and values, and that in theory, its institutional forms are distinct from those of the state, family, and market. However, in practice, the boundaries between the state, civil society, family, and market are far more complex and often blurred and continuously negotiated. Therefore, civil society commonly embraces a diversity of spaces, actors, and institutional forms, varying in their degree of formality, autonomy, and power. Civil societies are often populated by organizations such as the ones that I mentioned, Ashkala One, Cinematography Tangier, and so on and so forth. So why the term locus agonistis as the title of this project? First, in choosing the title, I wanted to reflect what I see as a state of play in cultural and political spaces that can be designated as being in transition. In such spaces, the dimension of associational life is most often characterized by levels of unacceptable antagonism that often result in disproportionate acts of violence against members of opposing political and social communities. In the Middle East and North Africa, where this project is conceptually located, it is often taken as a given that violence, either by the state or parastate actors, such as we see in Syria today, is the first and the only currency in which opposing views are met. But we do need to reflect on dimensions of cultural practice as possible locations where emerging forms of struggle, not predicated on violence or pure activism, are being formulated, often not in antagonistic, and here Chantal Mouffe is here, but in agonistic terms. I borrowed this from Chantal. Hence, my attempt to ground this project and my discussion of the idea of the civic imagination in a location or site of struggle. In deploying the term location of struggle, which is locus agonistis, I am evidently drawing from several conceptual references. One, the concept of jihad is important here, which in its pervasive contemporary form is often understood as a plea for violence as a foundational act of political and ideological struggle, when in fact its principal reference is of a more deeper individual act of spiritual struggle. I come from Nigeria, and Nigeria is currently embroiled in a conflagration of jihad. Nigeria has about 70 million Muslims, and I fear that 5 or 10 years from now, the country might not exist based precisely on this question. But I think it's important to separate the concept of jihad, such as oftentimes as being broadcasted in Nigeria. Jihad is a word that is supposed to be hated. So I want to simply make clear that I'm not referring to jihad in the sense that is oftentimes exploited in political terms, but more in terms of this kind of philosophical ambiguity towards the notion of struggle. Second point for me in locus agonistis is Homi Bhabha's idea of the location of culture, namely a site of a common cultural awareness and most of critical self-understanding, underscoring the conception of cultural forms. 3 is Charles Taylor's description of the dimension of social imaginaries as the basis where common understandings and features of cultural systems are created in exchange amongst complicit members of a given society or social formation. 4, Chantal Mouffe's important distinction between the political as a concept in which individuals are located in the context of power and hegemony, and politics, which are more expressive and subjective, as an ensemble of practices, discourses, institutions, and between antagonism and agonism, a critical shift in which the interlocutor moves from being a mortal enemy but to an adversary worthy to be engaged. 5, Alain Badiou's concept of metapolitics, which he sketches as the idea of politics as an event, politics as truth procedure. He links the political to the dimension of the collective, and he writes as an event that an event can be considered to be political if its material is collective. We say that the event is ontologically collective to the extent that it provides a vehicle for a virtual summoning of all. Collective means immediately universalizing. And finally, a reference to Habermas's theory of communicative action, in which practices and logics of the civic, to my mind, are fundamentally inscribed. I want to explain further what I mean then by practices and forms of the civic in my conceptualization of the context of practices that are rooted in societies in transition. If the given social situations of the last 2 decades in contemporary art have been marked by an increasing antagonism between economic spheres, globalization and anti-globalization, political subjectivities, insurgency and counterinsurgency, and we can see this in the work of somebody like Thomas Hirschhorn, and aesthetic strategies, activism and formalism, and we can see this in a few models like group material and others. In what ways are most of contemporary art and cultural representation advancing concepts of artistic and civic reflection that address the present interregnum? To be sure, the current forces of antagonism we see across the world are not novel. They are the result of the changing global relations and the emergence of diverse social imaginaries that have contributed to the broadening of cultural forms and political expressions and the expansion of the economic sphere. Throughout the history of modernity, such forces have been the sine qua non of reformist politics, and in the 20th and 21st centuries, they have become the common grammar of oppositional politics and contestatory cultural production. Today, situations of antagonism and oppositionality continue to proliferate, and in parts of the world that are undergoing radical transitions, the resonances are especially acute. The granular effects of the popular disenchantments that rise from these transitions are not confined within specific domains of contemporary practice. In fact, the proliferation of activist practices, which initially waned in the last decade of economic expansion, is slowly registering again as a fundamental cultural principle peculiar to this period of unsettledness between modes of global sovereignty and resistant social processes. The insurgent radical journalism of WikiLeaks, for example, the Free Gaza Flotilla, the Iranian Green Movement, and of course, Tahrir Square are important recent examples. In this transition between the events of September 11, 2001, and the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, and the broad scale of global insurgencies from Iran to Indonesia, Somalia to Yemen, Russia to Chechnya, and intranational resistance movements such as we find in places like Nigeria, old forms of power have been effectively called to account through the recasting of the philosophical architecture of contemporary politics and the transformation of the emancipatory logics of resistance that respond to and engage with them. The responses to these transnational challenges have distinct cultural dimensions also and involve the production of art and culture. Here, what I want to to specify, the question people will always ask is, how does the Arab Spring offer a possibility for artistic production or any form of cultural production. I think it's very important that in this particular moment that the role we should, or the stance we should assume should not be a stance, oh dear. Sorry. So it's not a call, it's my timer telling me to begin wrapping up. But in any case, telling me to begin. But in any case, the stance that I believe that we should adopt here is a stance not of prognosis, not about projection into the future, but I think we should have a much more skeptical stance, but a stance that is far more analytical, and I think is the stance of diagnosis, to be able to to think in which ways art and forms of cultural production have always engaged these moments, and not just simply to rush out immediately and do things around it. But that is not to say, as we will see in the projects of Meeting Point 6, that one cannot immediately take up the events of the present as points of departure for the making of interesting and engaged art. I think we certainly see this in the work of Radwan El-Medeb, whose work you will have the opportunity to see later in the coming days. I think you will see this in the writings of Omar Abu Sada in his monologue written in response to the dispatches by Adaf Suef from Tahrir Square. So of course there are already artists from Syria, from Lebanon, Tony Shakar, his meditation on the Facebook phenomena as a gathering place, as a place, if you will, of Civitas in the construction of models of engagement during the Arab Spring. But nevertheless, I think that our responses should be much more diagnostic rather than prognostic. So the responses to these transitional challenges, to me, have embrace a broad spectrum of activities, practices, positions, institutions, and social forms that can be felt in diverse pressure points. At the core of these pressure points, at once local and national, global and transnational, secular and theological, regional and geopolitical, is what may be characterized as a rising dimension of civic imagination. Artistic practices and logics as modes of constructing and constituting civitas. They constantly induce fresh demands for emancipatory civic techniques that advocate the obviation of the simplistic dichotomy between progressivist assumptions of political forums and the seemingly conservative institutions of national cultures. These two things have to come together. In this way, civic techniques also take to task strategies of activism and oppositionality, around which so-called radical practices have been traditionally perceived within institutional cultural formations that are seemingly anathema to the powers of transformation they seek to effect in such institutions. Let me just simply say one thing about, I'm not here critiquing activism per se, but I think the question one has to engage from the point of view of what is happening around the Arab Spring is whether one is a spectator or an observer. So from my point of view, the observatorial perspective seems far more analytical because the spectatorial stance offers a greater temptation to just simply be somebody on the sidelines. But I think we can have this discussion during the give and take between Haus and I, perhaps. So Locus Agonistic as a cultural project is located in the transnational nexus of global civic imaginaries. Meeting Point itself, as the name suggests, was integrally conceived as a response to the various scenarios of rupture between antagonistic political camps and civic critical cultures. Since its founding by Tarek El Fatou in 2005, Meeting Points has been a networked space for exploring momentous historical forces and the emancipatory logics that are currently reshaping debates on civic identities, political subjectivities, cultural strategies, and artistic practice in contemporary Arab societies and localities adjacent to them, for example, in Europe. At a basic level, it is a project shaped to organize a series of forums in the spirit of the Agora as a marketplace of ideas, actions, interactions, aesthetic proposals, performances, and public responses that endeavor to create locations of reasoned dissent and reflection. In fact, we can imagine the entire sequence of its activities to be connected to locations of struggle as spaces of becoming, as a possible sphere of the coming global civil society. For this current edition of Meeting Points, it is at the center of a unique political and social event, the Arab Spring. Here, Badiou's notion of politics as truth procedure and the collective as a summoning of all becomes powerfully sharpened. Meeting Point 6, in similar fashion, envisions the idea of the civic as a summoning of all, a way to enter into the contingent discursive arrangements that are currently reshaping Arab societies. Neither purely an artistic and performance event, nor an academic and theoretical forum, Locus Agonistis is an invitation to cultural producers and thinkers across all disciplines, including artists, filmmakers, choreographers, playwrights, poets, actors, performers, journalists, and so on, working inside and outside the immediate situations of Arab societies to convene cultural programs and artistic spaces situated at the intersection between sites of symbolic struggle for ideas and spaces in which concepts of civic practices are elaborated. The principal objective of the project is to explore diverse strategies of cultural production and to engage or to work beyond the dichotomies that are often features of antagonism centered on secular and religious difference. By initiating a series of discursive and perceptual systems in which fresh hypotheses of the civic can be articulated, presented, and debated, Locus Agonistis aims to participate in the dynamic, lively, and complex debates of contemporary critical cultures in Arab societies, to which I am a guest. Because past Meeting Point projects were generally focused on performance and so on, the basic premise and the stagecraft of Locus Agonistis is far more intimate, which is to develop projects and programs that will rely less on staging and theatricality, because these two tendencies often delineate a division between the space of the performer and that of the spectator as two separate spheres of encounter and interaction. The premise of this current project is to work in the opposite mode by directing attention at the inconclusive relationship between spectacle and spectatorship, between mediation and immediacy, between performance and conversation. Rather than emphasize separation or rely on highly theatrical strategies, the formal premise of Locus Agonistis are based on provisional structures and quotidian gestures. Certainly, the events of the last year make us aware of the powerful aspects of practice and logics of the civic, at least in political terms, in the sweeping mass movements that have galvanized millions across North Africa and the Middle East, in a historical mobilization of outrage against autocracy, dictatorships, and political, economic, and social injustice. But if we focus on the Arab Spring alone, we miss the important appeal of the civic in artistic terms, because the Arab Spring emerged directly from the state of global unsettledness, riven with both anxiety and hope, despair and courage. What can be best described in the Arab Spring, in fact, it has been described as a moment of an emergent revolutionary spirit in which masses of people create common cause to make themselves visible before their oppressors and to assert and make concerted claims to their rights as citizens has shifted well beyond their original targets. They have entered into the space of the civic imagination. Thank you.